Good afternoon, everyone. I think this is working. I'm Renee Kohler-Ryan, and we are delighted at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, to be sponsoring this room on excellence in education. So welcome very much here on behalf of the university. I just have one thing to spruik. You'll find all sorts of information about the university on your chairs and around you, but as you may have heard me say yesterday, we're starting a global centre for Catholic leaders. If anyone is interested in more information, scan the QR code and we'll put you on our mailing list for that. There's also something else, which is that we have some lucky door prizes. So if you're holding one of these pieces of paper on your seat and there's a post-it note on the back, then pop your hand up and I'll give you, oh good, got to take it. Here you go. Thank you. Anyone else? It's the way to get their attention. Is it you? All right, I've got two more. Oh, three more. Okay. Please. Let me just pass over to Dylan and I'll go around and give out the lucky door prizes. So I'm not stopping.
I was expecting more of a formal presentation. Okay, so that's the old joke. There's nothing like a good introduction, and that was nothing like a good introduction. So the notes to presenters invited us to do an acknowledgement of country. It's quite interesting because whenever I go to New Zealand, always happens. Whenever I go to Australia, always happens. When I go to Canada, it happens about half the time. When I go in the United States, it just never happens. But I'm still not sure about the acknowledgement of country if it's just a kind of piece of lip service. You know, if you really feel that badly, let's give some of the land back. You know, so I'm not going to do an acknowledgement of country as a foreigner because I think there's quite a long way to go. But anyway, I want to talk about, and I don't know why I was asked to do this talk because it's what the conference organizers asked me to talk about. But I want to, basically, this is the talk you're expecting, isn't it? Because I'm doing two workshops, the next one's different. So we have a real problem in that schools are held accountable on their kids' scores on these measures that the governments impose, things like NAPLAN, but also things like exams like HSC in New South Wales, VC in Victoria. And the real problem is it's a stupid measure of accountability because teachers don't have much influence on the final scores. So it's basically holding teachers to account for things they don't have much influence over. And I want to explain to you why that is and what we can do instead. So I want to talk about the 5 generations of school effectiveness research, because actually a lot of the claims that people make about effective schools are just not supported by the evidence. I think we know very little about school effectiveness. There's lots of people who say we know lots, but I don't think they're right. I think it's much more complex and much more messy than they say. There was a famous study by Chubb and Moe in the United States in the 1990s. Certain successful schools had certain kinds of leadership. And so their thesis was that with this kind of leadership, schools would be more effective. I think they got that exactly backwards. In the schools that are full of high-achieving, motivated kids, leaders can go around being the leaders they want to be. In schools where they're firefighting the whole time, they never even get to things like what happens in classrooms because they're actually controlling access to the premises and riots and things like that. So it's really hard to find good evidence. And the big takeaway is that a review by one of my former students, Rob Coe, of the research on leadership, as I mentioned in the panel discussion, concludes that basically we know almost nothing about what effective leaders do. Because people who do that sometimes are successful, sometimes they're not, and people who don't do any of those things are often very successful. So what I'm going to try to share with you today is not really about leadership or anything like that with this session and the next. It's what I think is the knowledge base that you need to know about to be the best leader that you can be. So I'm not going to tell you how to be a leader. I don't know enough about that. You know, I've been a leader. I've run a university. I've also taught Year 9 maths, and there's no doubt that teaching Year 9 maths is harder than running a university. I worked longer hours running a university, never worked as hard as I did when I was teaching Year 9 maths. So I don't know how you want to lead, but I do think there are some things that would be useful for you to know in order to be more effective leaders. So I'm talking about the 5 generations of school effectiveness research. I'm going to talk about a useful thing from Robin Hogarth, who died recently actually, has got this nice idea of kind and wicked learning environments. So a kind learning environment, I'll say more about that, is one where it's really quite easy to take your experiences in one area and translate it to a different area. And a wicked learning environment is where the learning in one context tells you almost nothing about how to be effective in a different context. And then I'm going to give you some, what I hope are useful guidelines for you to make sense of the research. Because everybody's telling you should follow the research. I'm saying it's a bit more complicated than that. So there are people making, there's always this research shows. And I thought it was quite interesting this morning. We had a couple of presentations, I think, that actually had research shows, but they actually had citations, which I think is a good trend. Because often people say research shows, to which I always respond, which research? Show me the studies. And it's usually a journalistic piece or a think piece with no evidence whatsoever. So the big idea here is that you need to be much more engaged in critiquing the research that people tell you should be using. Because it might not be done in your context, it might not be done with kids like yours, it might not even be done in a school. There are loads of people generalizing from laboratories, and you have to remember this. Most psychological research is done on undergraduates. Undergraduates are the most researched species on the planet. For 2 reasons. One is that undergraduates will do almost anything for course credit, and the other, that psychology professors are lazy. So basically, beware of that. One I'll talk about later tomorrow. In one study, they discovered that 75% of the studies on feedback were conducted on undergraduate students. No, I'm not against that, but is it going to apply to 6-year-olds? So, there are 2 main problems here. One is that learning is insensitive to the effects of instruction. Learning doesn't actually change that quickly. And the thing that I think you really probably haven't thought about before, but is really important in the context of NAPLAN, is the way that tests like NAPLAN are developed makes them even less sensitive to what teachers are changing. And that's why the school effect in Australia is tiny. It turns out that in Australia, it doesn't matter very much which school you go to in terms of how much progress you make. And ranking schools on the basis of NAPLAN scores is just stupid. Because most of the variation is caused by how much those kids knew when they started at that school. And we see that very strongly in America. Which is easier, recruiting smarter kids or changing what happens in school? And it's recruiting smarter kids, I tell you. It's much easier to boost the standing by actually getting better kids at the beginning. Okay, so the question is, do schools make a difference? So this has been a huge issue since probably the 1960s, the Coleman Report in America, the work of Basil Bernstein in England in the 1970s. And so the first claim was schools don't make a difference. And I think that actually, as long as you say much of a difference is okay. So the Coleman Report and Basil Bernstein's famous quote, schooling cannot compensate for society. And we heard that in the discussion between the Archbishop and the Minister this morning. And I think there's an element of truth in that. We shouldn't ask schools to fix all our problems. But actually, what's interesting is that schools can make a huge difference. And very many of the socioeconomic poverty-related gaps that we see are things that certain schools are changing around. So you may not have heard of the Michaela School in London, but it's just extraordinary. Now, I'm not sure I'd want that for my kid, but it's just an extraordinary proof of concept about what you can do with a highly structured, engaged, and rigorously research-supported environment. Okay, so then we started looking at correlates of student achievement. These are the things that good schools have about them, and I've already pointed out the problems. Let's look at the characteristics of high-performing schools. And I've given the game away already. It's recruiting high-performing kids. That's what they do. They do it very well. Some better research has looked at correlates of student progress. So let's actually see how much progress kids are making. So we've got value-added approaches. And of course, the other problem with value-added is if you want to show lots of value-added, keep the boys out. Become an all-girls school and your value-added will shoot up because girls do better. So that's why contextualized value-added was brought in. We have a real issue in England right now, which is that the lowest performing group are white working class boys. Almost every ethnic group outperforms white kids in England. But curiously, the highest performing group is working class Chinese girls, not middle class. The middle class, they're kind of there, they've made it, they're not quite so hungry. The working class kids are pushed more harder by their parents. But we get these big differences. So if you're in an ethnically diverse area, in America, we have problems. We teach diverse students. Well, in England, diversity is your greatest asset because the more kids you've got from non-white backgrounds, the better your results are going to be because they're working so hard. So that was contextualized value added. Let's take into account the intake. Then correlates of school improvement. That's a better thing to look at, not just how much the kids progress, but whether the school is getting better over time. But I think the most important one is direct experiments, because until you do direct experiments, you don't know whether this effect is causal. Without a direct experiment, it could be that it's just a correlation that's not a causation. And so direct experiments give us the best evidence about what to do to improve schools. So, magnitude of school effect. So we look at TIMSS, we look at PISA, and people look at charts like this. So this is a very famous one by Barry McGaw, who, of course, was director of ACER for a while, but he was then Director General of Education at OECD in Paris. And this shows how much of the variation on the PISA test, taken by 15-year-olds every 3 years, is how much of the variation is within the school, how much is between the schools. But of course, some of it is caused by the social background of the schools or the social background of the students. And so what is the variation that's not explained by the social background? The red bars there are the true school effects. There's a lot of variation in achievement in a school. Most of it is not to do with the school. And so you could see Australia, the school effect is 8%. 8% of the variation in student achievement is caused by the school a student attends. 92% is outside the school's control. And that's why I think it's stupid to hold schools accountable for their results. Now, I think it's okay to hold schools accountable for improving, but given that only 8% of the variation in school results are caused by the processes of the school, I think it's odd to say that a good school is one where kids get good results, because it might not be. The logic is about the same as choosing to have open heart surgery at a local clinic because nobody's died there recently. It just doesn't make any sense. And when I moved to America, the realtor that we employed to help us find a home, he would quote these test scores for these different districts. And I said, you do realize I'm a psychometrician? I work for the company that makes this test, and I know that it's telling you nothing about the quality of the schools. So, one of the things that's very quickly apparent, and it's amazing how exercised Americans get about this, because most countries seem to function quite well with a very mixed economy. So probably the most extreme example is the Netherlands, where something like 75% of kids go to schools that are funded by the government, but not operated by the government. And they're mostly church schools. Australia, I don't think is in this list, but that's the government-dependent private, and that's the government-independent private. But here's the killer. Which does better, private schools or government-funded schools? Well, if you look at the raw data, in most countries, private schools perform quite a lot better. But once you control for the social intake, the socioeconomic intake of the schools, there is not a single country in the world where kids going to private schools do better than kids going to government schools. once you control for the intake. Which, when you think about it, is kind of extraordinary, because the class sizes in private schools are much smaller. In England, for example, the average class size in state schools is 22, in the private schools it's 15, and the results, controlling for class, are identical. So I can only assume that the quality of teaching in the private schools is so bad that they have to get class sizes down to 15 to achieve what government schools achieve in classes of 22. I mean, there may be other explanations, but it's really interesting how when you dig into the data, how very little of the data explains anything across the system. And, you know, governments keep on saying we're going to have new kinds of schools, we're going to have city technology colleges, we're going to have academies, we're going to have charter schools in America. And it just basically makes almost no difference. It's politicians basically saying something must be done, this is something, we must do this. That's the logic, basically. And they're doing things, and they're just... There's a nice paper by Matthew Kraft from Brown University and his colleagues that have looked at 50 years of attempts in America to improve education, and what they've basically done, it's a wonderful piece of work. They say it's precisely estimated, they use economic or econometric approaches, and they can precisely rule out any impact any impact greater than a 1% increase in high school graduation. You know, there might be those tiny little effects, but they can rule out anything bigger than that. And so basically, governments have constantly tried to improve things, and they haven't because they've been focusing on the wrong issue. So here's one of the really interesting things, and this is where, you know, I have quite a lot of sympathy for John Hattie's research. What does 1 year's progress look like? So this goes back to 1957. The Educational Testing Service looked at how much progress does a kid make in a year, and the annual progress, you can see, is pretty close to 0.4 standard deviations. Right? So 0.4 standard deviations is the average progress in a year. The range in a class, by definition, is 4 standard deviations. 2 standard deviations above and below the mean. So what you've got is the class moving a tiny little bit up. So, you know, let's take a year 7 class. Where would the average kid in a year 7 class be in a year 6 class? They'd be in the upper half. But instead of being, say, 15th out of 30, they might be 13th or 12th out of 30. And this is the real issue, especially with systems that operate social promotion, like Australia. So there's a huge range of achievement, and every country has to deal with that. So, in Australia, social promotion, huge range of achievement, what I mentioned in the keynote. As of 11-year-olds, some kids struggling to match the 6-year-old, some kids outperforming the 16-year-old. In Germany and France, grade retention. So in Germany, I don't know if you know the German school system, you get a grade from 1 highest down to 6 lowest in every school subject. There's 6 of them in primary school. If you get a 5 or 6 in 2 subjects, you are required to repeat the grade. And by the age of 15, something like 25% of children have actually had to repeat a grade. If you repeat a grade, if you fail a second time, you repeat a grade. If you fail a third time, then you go into special ed. But that's their approach. So grade retention. The good news for teachers, of course, is the range of students' achievement in a class is much smaller, because students only get into 5th grade if they're ready for 5th grade work. The other approach used in the Far East is extra tuition. The juku in Japan, for example, these after-school crammers, very prevalent in Hong Kong. The top tutors get paid like $1 million a year. It was a real problem in Korea. The government was so worried about these expensive after-school classes, they tried to ban them. The parents rebelled. The most the government could secure was now there's a law you can't keep kids in an after-school class after 10 p.m. And you go into Seoul and you will see, go around the back of the school and there's some classes after 10 p.m. And they're covering up the windows to hide the fact that they're still teaching past 10 p.m. But that's the way that those countries operate. And that's why I don't take seriously any international comparisons until you control for extra tutoring. Like Shanghai, we're told to copy Shanghai. Yeah, but do you really want kids spending 57 hours every week in school? 30 hours in regular school, 27 hours in additional catch-up classes. So, for me, I think Australia's got a pretty healthy balance of sport and music and dramatics and things like that. It's not that hothousing, I don't think is very sensible. So here's an indication of how slow the progress is. This comes from Kath Hart's work in 1981, but it was replicated by Robert Coe, and they found exactly the same results, no improvement in educational achievement in something like 45 years. So this is the proportion of kids reaching each of these levels. And so here's the important takeaway. Let's look at level 4. At age 12, 24% achieve it. At age 15, 54% achieve it. In a class of 30 students, each year, 3 students will achieve a new level. So instruction is working for 3 kids in a class of 30. 27 of those kids either already knew this stuff or still don't know it at the end of the year. Now, partly that's because of really bad teaching, but partly it's because kids differ in how easy they find learning, and our systems don't cope with that. So there's a famous place in America called the Harlem Children's Zone, developed by Jeffrey Canada, and their motto is whatever it takes. So they're charter schools, and to apply, the parents and the kids have to agree to the rules, which is there's a test every Friday on what you've been learning that week. If you fail a Friday test, you're invited back to school on Saturday. If you fail 2 consecutive Friday tests, you have to return for additional Saturday schooling. And people say this is very punitive. I think it's inclusive. It is saying, we're not going to let you fall behind. Some students learn more slowly than others, as I made clear in the keynote. The question is, what are you going to do about that? How are you going to get extra support to the students who need the support? You may not like the Harlem Children's Zone's approach, but at least they have an answer to, what are you going to do? This is Richard Dufour's famous question. Don't tell me you believe that all students can succeed. Tell me what you do when they don't. And unless you have an answer for that question, you are just paying lip service of education for all. So this is a more accurate version of this chart, and so this is why I think a lot of John Hattie's work is difficult to interpret. That's researcher code for meaningless. He says the average growth is 0.4. And, as an average, I'm okay with that. But I'm suspicious, being a statistician, I'm suspicious of averages. I don't think the person with 1 foot in boiling water and 1 foot in freezing water is, on average, comfortable. But the important point is, if you do a study that produces a 50% increase in the rate of achievement with 6-year-olds, you'll get an effect size of about 0.7, 0.8. If you do the same thing with 15-year-olds, you'll get an effect size of 0.1. So adding effect sizes that are done on different ages of students makes no sense to me. And that's why, for example, one of the things he finds very, very influential are things like Piagetian studies. Well, yes, because they're done on young children, get bigger effect sizes. This is actually my very first published paper, looking at how does the rate of increase spread with different kinds of measures. So as children get older, they get more spread out. So the logic is very simple. Some students learn faster than others. You know that. You can see it. So the longer the kids have been on the planet, the more time the faster learning kids have to pull ahead. And that's why the range of achievement gets bigger. And that's why effect sizes get smaller. Because when you're doing an effect size calculation, you're dividing by the standard deviation of the population. So when the population gets more spread out, the standard deviation of the population gets bigger. And so therefore the denominator of your fraction is bigger, and therefore your fraction is smaller. That's why we get bigger effect sizes with younger kids. But what is really quite important here is the diversity. So you get these different tests. Some have kids growing much more slowly because they're based on what kids are learning at school. And some kids are some are diverging much more because they're based on cognitive development. So let me give you an extreme example, okay? It's very difficult to distinguish in maths between a precocious 7-year-old and a slow-achieving 14-year-old. The work they do is quite similar. So actually, it's kind of smarts or raw thinking ability that matters for progression in mathematics. In science, it's much more to do with attendance in science lessons. Because most of the things that kids learn in science are not things that people figure out for themselves. I mean, the idea that an object thrown maintains constant velocity forever is so deeply counterintuitive that nobody would, maybe apart from Isaac Newton, would come up with that on their own. So what matters in science is going to science lessons. And in English, what matters is maturity. So there's no sense in which the work of a 14-year-old matches the work of a precocious 7-year-old. Because the 14-year-old, even though they might not be great at writing, has much more experience of the world. So you get these different models of progression in different subjects based on what makes you get better at something. Okay. So you've got visible learning with John Hattie, looking at correlates. So for a while, the biggest effect size in John Hattie's work was student self-reported grades, effect size of 1 standard deviation. What's the correct interpretation of that? Is it that getting students to report their grades makes them better? Nope. No amount of getting students to self-report their grades has any impact on their improvement. What the research shows is that kids who are smart know they're smart. So if you get kids to self-report, you'll get very high correlation between their self-reports and their actual scores. Now, the worst one is teacher collective efficacy, which has an effect size of 1.6, based on one unpublished PhD dissertation, where all the studies were correlational. So just to be clear, teacher collective efficacy is individual teacher efficacy. Do I have the resources to do my job? Do I feel efficacious in my job, averaged across a school? So why do you get effect size of 1.6? Because in schools full of highly motivated kids that are well-resourced, teachers feel collectively efficacious. It's not teacher collective efficacy that causes high achievement, it's high achievement that causes teacher collective efficacy. And that's the biggest problem with John Hattie's work, is that he actually uses correlations as causes. And there are ways of developing causal relationships from correlational studies. The most famous work is Austin Bradford Hill's, because, really, if you're going to adopt a hard line experimental approach, we would not know that smoking causes cancer. Because to the hard line RCT, randomized control trial, we would need to get people, well, half of them have to smoke a pack a day for 20 years, and half of them must not smoke for 20 years, and we'll compare the outcomes at the end. We didn't do that. What we did was we look at things that make it more or less plausible that there is a causal relationship. And there's ways of doing that, but they're quite weak. So, so let me just, don't know why that jumped forward then. Yeah. Okay, so this is the one I want. My machine's gone to sleep. So this is data from England, and it was the last data before the government got rid of contextualized value added. So we used to control for the sex of the kids and also their social class and also their ethnicity. And the government said, no, that was wrong to control for the kids' socioeconomic background, because somehow that meant you wouldn't actually try hard with kids from poor backgrounds. That was the logic of the government minister at the time, which makes no sense to me, because I've never heard any, I don't know if you know this, I don't know if you have anything similar in Australia, but in England, if you're admitted to hospital, you are classified according to one of 57 diagnostic categories, and they do not publish mortality stats unadjusted. They're always adjusted for how sick the patient was when they went into hospital. And I've never heard people say, well, that means that doctors won't try if the patient's really sick. But that's the logic of saying we mustn't control for social class. But this shows how much progress the kids made, normed on 1,000. The vertical axis is what proportion of kids get 5 good grades, including English and mathematics. And you can see at the top of the chart there, there's some schools, those are what we call grammar schools, they're highly selective, and they're getting every kid up to that level, but the amount of progress kids are making is pretty average. You've got schools over here whose result, look at this one here. It looks like it's a terrible school because those kids aren't even making the average progress. But that's because those kids are starting from a very low baseline. And this, by the way, the value added is based on their achievement at 11, not a random hypothetical. It's actually how well they scored on tests of English, maths, and science. But here's the problem. The middle 50% of even of contextualized value added is not significantly different from average. And here's the real problem. You see, politicians defend NAPLAN by saying parents can use it to decide on a school. But what is a parent really doing? If they're choosing a primary school or a secondary school, they're really taking a bet on how good that school will be in 5 years' time when my child finishes. So how good is achievement now for judging how good that school will be in 5 or 6 years' time? And the answer is, basically, there's no information there at all. The 95% confidence interval includes 0 for practically every single school. How good a school is now tells you almost nothing about how good it's going to be in 5 or 7 years' time. So this whole venture of trying to give parents information for making school choices is, in my view, misguided. And it's not very honest. And the effects are small. So if we take the proportion of 15-year-olds reaching a particular level, we could choose NAPLAN or PISA for Australia. So if 15 students in a class reach this in the average school, 17 would do so in a so-called good school, and 13 would do so in a so-called bad school, one standard deviation below the mean. I think those differences are much smaller than people generally imagine. The progress kids make is very similar in different schools. That said, I think that parents quite like schools full of high-achieving, motivated students because, as we heard from, sorry? Steve, yes, I can remember his first name. Choosing peers is quite important. There are strong peer effects. So, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. We can talk about it tomorrow in the workshop if you're interested. But this is the big takeaway, okay? Test producers want their tests to be reliable. Basically, they get punished if their tests aren't reliable. Okay, so what is reliability? Well, it's a kind of signal-to-noise ratio. It's how much of the difference in scores between kids is how good they are really versus random error. So technically, reliability is a signal-to-signal plus noise ratio, but that's not important. The only way to improve a test reliability is either to make it longer or to make it narrower. Basically the same thing. Have more questions focusing on a narrow range of content. So you could actually narrow the focus of the test, but here's what they do. Basically, they spread the scores out of the whole score range. So you might wonder, shouldn't NAPLAN tests for year 5 tell you how well the kids have mastered year 5 content? Well, that would be a logical thing to do, wouldn't it? Let's give parents information about how well their kids have mastered what's in the curriculum for year 5. But that's not what happens, because if you did that, then the kids' scores would be quite bunched together. So what test developers do is they add questions that stretch out. So let's take a hypothetical example. You've got a question that no kid gets right at the beginning of year 7, and every kid gets right at the end of year 7. That question is clearly measuring something that schools are teaching well, and yet it will never get included in the test for year 7 kids, because it has no discrimination. If you actually replace that with a question that half the kids get right at the beginning of year 7, and exactly half get right at the end of year 7, you will make the test more reliable because you're stretching the kids out more. So the whole basis of test construction reduces the extent to which standardized tests are measuring what teachers change. And that's not widely recognized. Did anybody know that before? A couple of people, yeah. It's very, very, very poorly appreciated. And what we really want is criterion reference tests that tell you how the kids mastered the content. And they turn out to be not very reliable, because actually in a good school, you get almost everybody mastering the content. Okay, so let's now look at correlates of school improvement, and this is Tony Brike's work on schools in Chicago. I think this is really interesting and this mirrors some of the themes we've been hearing about today from several people. So basically, here's the background: mayoral control of schools. Many schools failed to improve. So there was basically an attempt to improve the schools by taking over. It didn't work. So what Tony Brike did was to look at, over the next few years, what correlates were there of school improvement? Did the school improve over a period of time? And they looked at school leadership, parent-community school ties, professional capacity, student-centered learning climate, and instructional guidance. Those are the key variables they thought might be relevant. And what they did was they produced, for English, or in fact reading in this case, and maths, the proportion of schools that improved substantially. So they're looking at, were they in the top 25%? So if the school was weak in leadership, only 12% of the schools reached the 25% threshold. Where the leadership was strong, 44% did, or 43%. Parental involvement, work orientation, this is basically teachers focusing on teaching, discipline, and curriculum alignment. And so what you can see here is now we're beginning to get to the real issues about when schools improve and when they don't. When these 5 things are strong, the improvement is much higher than the benchmark 25%. When they're weak, they're not. So we're going to see, and of course the real problem is, although those things are listed as 5 separate variables, they kind of go together. So you don't tend to find schools that are very strong on one and very weak on another. They tend to be part of a whole school package improvement. And the maths is very similar. And I think what's really fascinating for me is the bottom 2 here, parent involvement and leadership. Just look how much of a difference getting that right makes in terms of schools' results. So now this is not quite a randomized controlled trial, because it could be that these schools did all this because of exceptional leadership, for example, but now we're beginning to look at what makes things better. Now let's look at the size of teacher effects, and this is basically going into more detail about the claims I made this morning in the keynote. So there's no doubt that the biggest influence is student characteristics. Some kids learn better than others. In England, we found that 80% of the variation in school leaving exam results are basically predictable from IQ tests given at the age of 11. People don't like IQ. People think IQ has been discredited. It's the strongest predictor of occupational prestige at the age of 65. And this is my test of a good researcher, by the way. Ian Ayres says, for any researcher, name me 2 results that you believe but wish were not true. And that's a good way of telling you, have you got a researcher here or have you got an advocate? Because advocates basically say that any research that criticizes their beliefs is a flawed research project, basically badly done research. And so one of the things I've tried to do over my career is to be as critical of the research studies that support my point of view as I am of the ones that contradict my point of view. And I've changed my mind about some things, like the importance of IQ and cognitive load theory, by the way. School organization doesn't seem to make much of a difference. So instructional quality. So here's where we run into problems. Because teaching quality, definitely more important than teacher quality. But we can't measure teaching quality. We have no way of measuring how good teaching is. We really don't. Everybody thinks they know a good teacher when they see one, but the evidence is they don't. What we can do is determine whether some teachers are more effective than others. Do kids make more progress in some teachers' classrooms than others? So this is one of the best syntheses of this research. And this is from Rick Hanischek and his colleague. And so I just want to explain what this means. If all teachers were equally good, these effect sizes would be 0. In other words, you make the same progress in every teacher's classroom. So what they did was they looked at the progress that kids make and then see, is it the same in every classroom? If it's not, how spread out are those effects? And so what you can see here is, if you're taught by a teacher who is, so I don't know how much familiarity you have with the stats, but so the standard definition of a standard deviation is not that helpful. So here's how I'm going to explain it to you. A teacher who is 1 standard deviation better than the mean is just in the top 1/6 of all teachers. So basically, if a teacher is just in the top 1/6, in this New Jersey study, the kids would make 0.1 standard deviations more progress in reading and 0.11 more progress in maths. And because most of these studies are done in upper elementary school, primary school, as we'd call them here, then that's pretty big. That's a 25% increase. Because if you take the 1 year's progress is 0.4, which it is for 10-year-olds on average, then a 0.11 effect size, you're going to make 25% more progress every year. And you can look at all these, and I think there's 2 things that have come out for this. Very different effects, different assumptions, different answers. The maths effects are bigger than the reading effects, which is kind of predictable, because I think school experience matters more for mathematics than it does for reading. A lot of kids are reading at home. And a reasonable kind of average, let's say it's 0.15. I mean, basically, so you make 0.15 more progress in the classroom of a good teacher than an average teacher. So let's take a group of 50 teachers teaching the same subject. So let's say year 7 maths. If you are taught by the best teacher in that group of 50, you will learn in 6 months what students taught by the average teacher will take a year to learn. And if you're taught by the least effective teacher in that group of 50, the same learning will take you 2 years. So here's the really strange thing. Schools don't make a difference, teachers do. How can that be? Because teacher quality, I believe, is pretty randomly distributed in the system, because the most effective, the highest paying schools don't know how to recruit the best teachers because we don't know what good teachers look like. It's very hard to judge how good a teacher is by seeing how they teach. More interestingly, work by Bridget Hamray and Robert Pianta shows that in the classrooms of the best teachers, best for both instructional growth and emotional support, achievement gaps do not arise. Kids from socioeconomically disadvantaged, kids with difficulty in behavior at the age of 5 make the same progress as kids who are much more advantaged. So this is where I think maybe Basil Bernstein was wrong. Maybe schooling can, to a very large degree, if not entirely, compensate for society. And so basically, I think we can actually have schools making a big difference in outcomes for young people. So what makes the difference? Let's find out why these teachers are better, and let's make sure we got more of that. Unfortunately, teachers make a difference, but what makes the difference in teachers? Nobody knows. Advanced content matter knowledge is definitely less than 5%. Pedagogical content knowledge is at most 10 to 15% in primary, maybe a bit more in secondary. Does doing a master's degree make you a better teacher? No. I say that as somebody who used to run the institution with the largest number of master's degrees in education. We had 57 different master's degrees in education, and every single one of them was assessed with written essays. Not one of them actually watched somebody teach. Even the one called Masters in Teaching didn't have people being observed teaching. So, the total explained difference is less than 25%. That's why I call it the dark matter of teacher quality. We know that teachers make a difference, but we don't know what makes the difference in teachers. And that's why I think it's very dangerous for policymakers to think, well, we're going to need more of this or we need more of that. You know, the ACEC standards, even if they're right, they're unprioritized. I don't think they are right. I don't think they are the most important variables, but even if they are right, why are politicians so unwilling to say, this is more important than that? Because it gets into arguments. So we have these lists of unprioritized standards. And so therefore, teachers can get better at any one of them and improve their overall rating. And I'm saying that's wrong. We should have the teachers getting better at the things that make the biggest difference to their students. That's why I don't think we're making much progress. Okay, this is a very depressing study. So they looked at 161 professional development programs designed to increase the mathematics content knowledge of primary school mathematics teachers. And so they had different durations, but the average duration was 53 hours, pretty long. They restricted the analysis to those where teachers had actually completed the program, a good faith effort. So the change in achievement was 0.11 standard deviations over the course of the program. But because they then administered delayed post-tests at different intervals, they managed to figure out that all the learning that had been caused over this 53 hours was entirely gone in 37 days. The gain in achievement was completely gone. So yes, I would like to have more knowledgeable primary school teachers. I would love to have more knowledgeable primary school teachers. But what if we start from the system we already have? Donald Rumsfeld got into real problems over the Vietnam War. And he said, sorry, no, not the Vietnam War, the Iraqi War. Secretary of Defense at the time, I think. And he said, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish you had. And Robert Pondisio has pointed out the same thing is true for education systems. You design your education system around the teachers you have, not the teachers you wish you had. And his point is, in the United States, let's design an education system that is achievable by the 3.7 million people who are currently teaching. And so we can wish for more knowledgeable, more charismatic, more exciting teachers, but what do we do with the teachers we've already got? That's the issue. So let's be clear, and I think the point that Jordana was making, I think this morning was important, the quality of the curriculum, the size of the classes, the time teachers have to plan teaching, the resources available, the skills of the teacher, but the skills of the teacher do seem to be very important. So what should we do? Should we replace existing teachers with better ones, or should we invest in the teachers we already have? That's the issue. And there are people who will say, let's just fire the bad teachers. But can we do that? Can we work out who the good teachers are? Let's find out. So, Teach for America, Teach First, basically try to do this, but it's going to be a minority scheme. It's only going to be 1% of teachers, ever, because they're only staying there for 2 or 3 years. Let's raise the bar. Let's get smarter people into teaching. You know, in Finland, entry into medical school is easier than entry into teacher education programs. People say that's the reason for the success. It's also true in Ireland. Many universities where it's harder to get into primary education than it is to get into medical school. Can you imagine having this conversation with your doctor? How do you end up as a doctor? Well, I wanted to be a primary school teacher, but I wasn't good enough. But the point is that Finland's results have been dropping, and Ireland's results are okay, but nothing special. So actually getting smarter people into teaching does not make a difference because, it's a certain amount of ability. Being smarter does not make you a better teacher. So let's say we removed the lowest 30% of the teachers. So there's the teacher quality. Let's get rid of the lowest 30%. Let's stop hiring them. We'd raise the mean for that cohort to 55. It would actually increase teacher quality by 0.5 standard deviations. So overall, we'd get an increase in the rate of student learning by 20 to 25% once we replaced all the teachers. So basically, it's going to take a generation to do that. So I think our kids can't wait. So I just want to take a break there, let you draw breath, and just think about talking to a neighbor, or if you're antisocial yourself, what's the most interesting, surprising, or challenging thing you've heard so far? What's the most interesting, surprising, or challenging thing you've heard so far? Okay, so can we come back together? So I'm just going to rattle through a brief summary of the research. You can read about this in a book I called Leadership for Teacher Learning. Can we predict the good teachers from their qualifications? So this is the work of Doug Harris and Tim Sass, looking at what courses people took at university, primary, middle, and high school. A plus means they're better than average, a minus means they're worse than average. The same number of pluses and minuses, mostly empty, no relationship, and some strange ones, like the higher your maths teacher scored on a maths test at the age of 18, the lower your progress is going to be. I don't know what that means. Could be just noise, just random. But basically, it's very hard to tell how good a teacher is going to be from their qualifications. Can we observe? What about watching them teach? Okay. So, 7 teachers, 3 of them high performing, 4 of them not. So group 1, above average in each of the last 3 years. The other group, never above average in any of the last 3 years. People were shown videos of these teachers teaching and asked, is this one of the good teachers or one of the less good teachers? Don't forget, guessing would have got you right answer 3.5 times out of 7. Average score, 2.8. People couldn't even reach chance levels. The best were mentors, 47%. Oh, actually, one group did even better. Primary school children. They got it right half the time because they were just guessing. So one criticism you can make of that experiment was the differences were too small. So this second experiment, they actually then did one group definitely above average, one group definitely below average, and then asked senior principals and vice principals to rate them, 165 school leaders, distribution of correct ratings. Guessing would have got you 4 out of 8, 3.85. Why? Well, it's because learning is a long-term change. It's very hard to predict how much of what's happening in this classroom today will these kids remember in 3 weeks' time. And when you think that the learning that causes kids to think makes learning stickier, it often kind of makes the lesson seems a bit less smooth and well-oiled. What about training them first, rather than just showing them at it? So this is the Danielson framework, probably the best validated framework for teacher observation ever developed. Interestingly, domains 1 and 4, planning and preparation, professional responsibilities, no relationship with student progress. Domains 2 and 3, positive. That's important. It's also important when you think about things like the ACEC standards, because it's very possible for teachers to improve their performance on a standard that has no relationship to student progress. And if you're under pressure to get a higher rating, work on domain 1 and 4, because it's much easier to show improvement there than it is to change the way you teach. So here's how what they found. So if you're taught by a teacher who is distinguished, you will make more progress in both reading and mathematics. You'll make about 30% more progress. which is worth having. But don't forget that earlier research I showed you was the best teachers are 400% more productive than the least effective. So the best observation instruments we have capture less than 10% of the variation in teacher quality. Not nothing, but there's an awful lot of teachers who could actually get worse as teachers by getting a higher rating on this scale, because you're only capturing a bit of the variation. The more lessons you observe from a teacher, obviously, the better rating you'll get. The more different people you have doing the rating, the better rating you'll get. So this is the work of Heather Hill and her colleagues. So the reliability of the rating gets higher as you get more lessons observed and as you get more raters. But if you set yourself the bar of, say, 0.9 reliability, which is what we'd say was needed for kids, you would need to have every teacher judged by 5 different raters. You need 30 observations of a teacher just to get a reliable rating of how good they are on that rubric. This is not even to do with how good the kids are learning, how well the kids are learning. It's just whether that teacher would get the same rating the next time. And you know this. You know, many of us have had the experience of teaching parallel classes. And you teach the same lesson to one class and it goes brilliantly, and you teach it to another class and it goes terribly. And if somebody observes you teaching the first class, they think you're a genius. And if they see you teaching the second class, they think you're an idiot. But it's the same teacher with those random factors. Can we identify teachers from good? So this is the study I mentioned earlier. So I wasn't sure how many people would be there for the keynote, but here's a better study. This is 212 teachers teaching different high school subjects. And they classified how much progress their kids made, and they used 2 statistical models. One's what's called a random effects model, and one's a fixed effects model, if you're interested in the differences. So teachers have been classified into groups of 20% according to the 2 models. Here's the thing I would like you to look at. 9% of the teachers who are rated as the very best in one model were rated as the very worst in the other model. And there's no basis for choosing between these 2. They're both completely acceptable ways of analyzing the data. What if we combine all the evidence from different sources? Observations, test scores, student surveys. So that's what the Gates Foundation funded Measures of Effective Teaching project did. And they found that the best prediction of next year's scores, 81% on the value added, 17% on classroom observation, 2% on Ron Ferguson's tripod pupil survey. And what they found was this. Correlation with standardized test score gains, 0.69, okay. But if you then don't use standardized tests but use more authentic measures like writing, the correlation drops to 0.29, and the reliability is only 0.51. So that means to get a 0.9 reliable rating of a teacher, you need to collect data on that teacher for 9 years. Just in case you're interested, that's what a correlation of 0.69 looks like. And that's what a correlation of 0.29 looks like. So let's forget all that. We're going to do it anyway. We're going to take out the bad teachers, okay? So this is Winters and Cowan research. So they actually used real data from Florida, looking at reading in primary schools. And so they modeled what would happen if we took out the worst performing X% and replaced them with average teachers. So what would be the impact on student achievement? And they explored 2 different policy options. One is, you're out if you get in the bottom 70% in each of 2 years, or averaged over 2 years. Obviously, one's more stringent than the other. So the 2-year average is probably more aggressive, because if a teacher could have 1 bad year and then a good year, so they wouldn't be included in the first model, but they might be in the second model. But here's what they found, and here's the thing I like to draw out. If you take out the bottom 25% of the teachers who are in the bottom 25% over 2 years, 2-year average, you get an extra 0.7 of a week's progress per year. 3 days more progress. Why? Because your identification of the below average teachers is so inaccurate, you're taking out some above average teachers. So yes, if we could work out who the bad teachers are, let's get rid of them now, let's fire the lot of them. But you can't, because some teachers have good years and bad years. There's a famous example by Cathy O'Neill in a book called Weapons of Math Destruction. And she explores the misuse of statistics in everyday life. And one example she tells is the story of Tim Clifford, who was an English teacher, high school English teacher in New York, when New York introduced a value-added system for their teachers. So every teacher was given a rating from 0 to 100. The first year of this scheme, Tim Clifford got a score of 6. If he hadn't been tenured, he would have been fired on the spot. But he had tenure, so he kept his job. And of course, there wasn't much useful information, but 6, Feedback, yeah, do better next time, basically. Like telling a bad comedian, be funnier. It's accurate, but not very helpful. The next year, he got a score of 96. Why? Because the error of measurement of teacher quality on a 0 to 100 scale is about 40, 50 points. So he's probably average. And he got an unlucky score one year and a lucky score the next year. Anybody, and this is why it's not just hard it's in principle impossible, because every teacher builds on the foundations laid by her predecessors. In Florida, where I live, reading and writing are both part of the 3rd grade curriculum, but only reading is tested. So you're a 3rd grade teacher and you're being held accountable. There's no incentive for you to do any work on writing unless you think it's going to help the reading. If you're a 4th grade teacher, you hope and pray that the teacher who had your kids last year did some writing, because otherwise you're starting from scratch and you're in real trouble. Every teacher builds on the foundations laid by her predecessors, and that's why I don't think we can actually identify individual teacher quality accurately enough. The only way to improve education achievement at scale is to invest in the teachers we already have. What I call the love the one you're with strategy. Stop trying to measure how good teachers are, and instead create an environment where every teacher supports every other teacher in getting better. So, where should we focus our efforts? So this is the idea of wicked and kind learning environments. So we learn something in one context, and we apply it somewhere else. Chess is a kind learning environment. The rules are the same in the next game of chess. Tennis is a kind learning environment, even if you're playing very different opponents. I claim that education is a wicked learning environment, because what you learn in one context might not be useful in another context because of the poor match. Okay, so performance is not learning. So here's what, I'm not going to go through this in any detail. Some students got blocked problems, do all the same kind of problem, and some students got problems that were mixed up. Here's the important takeaway. So the blocked one, they got type A problems, then type B, then type C, then type D. The mixed problems were all mixed up. Here's the results. At the end of the study, the kids who'd done the mixed problems did much worse, but when they were tested weeks later, it stuck. So things that work in the short term may not work in the long term, and vice versa. Weak signal, lots of noise. So the Charlotte Dennison's framework that I mentioned earlier on has been used to look at teacher quality. So this is the rating the teacher got, top 20%, next 20%, and so on, versus the class incoming achievement quintile. So here's the killer fact. If you're teaching kids in the bottom 20% of achievement, you have a 5% chance of getting a top rating. If you're teaching kids in the top 20%, you have a 34% chance of getting a top rating. Everybody looks better when they're teaching smart kids. It is basically impossible to separate the contribution of the teacher from the contribution of the students. Weak signal, lots of noise. This is the study I mentioned briefly about reading recovery. At the end of first grade, reading recovery students were doing 0.69 standard deviations better, a huge effect. But at the end of fourth grade, they were doing much worse. It's messy. It's really complicated. And then you've got things like Contextual factors. So are you doing anything on multi-tiered systems of support? Yeah, okay. So it originated in response to intervention. So here's the only national evaluation we've done in the US. So 146 schools, standard measures of achievement. This chart just shows that the system was being operated. So at the beginning, Tier 1, 59% of students. Some were moved to Tier 3, some were moved to Tier 2, 86% stayed where they were. I show this just to show that students were being moved around based on their performance in the tier they were in. How do they do? Well, the effects are small or negative. Basically, the number of twice as many schools MTSS made things worse than made things better. Why? Who's teaching Tier 2 and Tier 3? Your best teachers, I hope not. I hope your best teachers are teaching Tier 1. So where Tier 2 and Tier 3 are staffed by teachers who are as good as your Tier 1 teachers, then MTSS can be highly effective. But where you're struggling to recruit teachers, like with class size reduction, MTSS can be disastrous, because being in the classroom of an excellent teacher in a group of 30 is better than being in a class of 2 or 3 with a teacher who doesn't know what they're talking about. This is not to criticize MTSS, this is just to say you need to know whether the additional teachers are there or not, of additional quality. And then when things work or don't work, without good theories, we may learn the wrong lessons. So an example here is the work that Joe Bowler and I did on ability grouping in mathematics. We tracked 1,000 kids in 6 different schools over a 5-year period. And we've got some results about kids in the top sets versus the bottom sets. And we found that kids in the bottom sets were doing worse than the kids in the top sets. But after the study was completed, we realized we hadn't taken into account teacher quality. It could be that the best teachers have been given to the top sets. So we have no idea how to make sense of our data now, because we didn't understand how big a variable teacher quality was. So basically, we didn't learn the right lesson because we didn't know that was important at the time. So we have to learn from research. And the major takeaway I'd like you from this section is beware of success stories. So have you been told to read From Good to Great? I mean, it was, okay, here's a little interesting factlet. If you'd invested in the companies that were listed in From Good to Great, you would have lost money compared to just putting your money in the American stock market. Those companies did actually worse than average. Why? Well, what you forget is that what Jim Collins did was to look at companies that went from good to great. He didn't take into account the companies that went from good to gone. These companies basically pursued high-risk strategies. Some of them were successful, and some of them weren't around to tell the story of their failure. And so this is a really important, beware of success stories. First of all, most people who are successful have no idea why they were successful. Don't ask people, what's the secret of your success? They don't know. In my first job as a Pro-Vice Chancellor, I was very successful. In my second job, in a much smaller institution, I was much less successful. And it was quite sobering to me to realize the reason was I was successful in my first job is because it was a large university, the people in my support team were world class. And in a smaller institution where we're paying less money, those people were less good. And so it was sobering for me to realize that it wasn't me, it was the team. And I could have told you, why were you so successful? Why would they ask you to apply to be the Vice Chancellor? And I would have told you stories about all the things I did. But the people around me would not be top of my list. Quite a sobering finding, that. And my favorite example of this is the work of Abraham Wald at Columbia in the Second World War. He was asked to help out with identifying planes that had come back and saying, where do we need to armor these planes more? So they had data on where these planes were getting hit. So all the data on where the flak and the machine guns that were being fired at these planes were hitting. And they were about to embark on a project of reinforcing, of making better armor on the places that were getting hit. And Abraham Wald pointed out that is precisely the wrong thing to do. Because the planes that are getting hit here are making it back. You need to armor the places where there are no bullet holes, because those planes aren't coming back. And that's the problem with success stories, survivorship bias. So, my first piece of advice relates to Chesterton's fence. You may have heard of this. Who's heard of Chesterton's fence? Okay. So it's really taken off in the last few years, actually, even though the story was written in 1929. Anyway, I'll let you read it. So before you get rid of anything, be clear about why it was there in the first place. Because it may be doing a job you haven't underappreciated yet. So, basically, before you change anything, understand. This is very simple Stephen Covey stuff. Seek first to understand, then be understood. But too often people say, well, I don't see the purpose of that, let's get rid of it. But it might be performing an important function. So the other thing is, proposals for change are usually clear about what they need to change, and they're usually silent about the things that the old system did quite well. So whenever anybody makes a proposal, I say, well, what would be better if the changes are made? And what would be worse if the changes are made? And very often the answer comes back, nothing. In which case, that person is unserious. There will always be trade-offs. The question is whether they're explicit or not. There's no such thing as an improvement that has no downside. So you've heard of the law of unintended consequences? There is no such law. Unintended consequences arise when people make changes without thinking them through deeply enough. So basically, think about what the downside will be, and then say, yeah, I accept that, but it's still worth doing because the upside is better than the downside. I don't think there's a single thing I've ever seen that doesn't have some downside, some negative, and it might be that most kids are better off and a few kids are worse off. Okay, let's talk about that, let's value that. Let's have that discussion explicitly rather than having these so-called unintended consequences emerging as unplanned outcomes of decisions taken earlier. So, I have 5 questions that I think we should be addressing. The first one is, does this address a problem we have? For example, there's quite a lot of research on teacher recruitment, how to choose the best teachers. Interviews aren't very good, but neither is anything else. But here's the issue. If you are struggling to recruit teachers, then choosing amongst the teachers isn't an issue because you're just desperate to get one. So, you don't have a problem with picking amongst 5 excellent teachers. You just want one sentient body. If we do this, how much faster will our students learn? And if anybody gives you an effect size, say, no, I don't want an effect size, I want a percentage. How many extra months of learning? What's the increase in the rate of student learning? And researchers will say, oh, it's very difficult to work out that. I say, fine. But I need to know, because I can't make a decision without that information. The researchers who say, we'll give you an effect size or a percentile ranking change are basically like the drunk looking for his keys underneath the streetlight. Is that where you drop the keys? No, but this is where the light is. The researchers are doing the things that are easy for them to do, not the things that you need. You can't make a decision about whether a reform is worth introducing unless you know how much extra achievement you're going to get and what will be the cost in money and in teacher time. then can we implement it here? Class size reduction, for example. Do you have enough good teachers? Do you really want to follow the Singaporean model of having every kid spending 2 or 3 hours in catch-up classes after school, and parents spending money on the tutors? And then finally, and this may be the most important one, do you know what to do? This is why I'm very critical of work like Robert Marzano's syntheses and meta-analyses and John Hattie's, is because even if you accept that collaborative learning has an effect size of whatever it is, do you know what to do? Do you know what's in the box? And the point is that most educational experiments are spelled out in such poor detail that you have no idea what they did to get that effect size. The other problem with effect sizes is that, strictly speaking, effect sizes are only justifiable when they're unnecessary. That sounds really weird, but let me explain. If we've got different ways of teaching maths, for example, and we decide to do several experiments with different approaches to teaching maths, each one with a control group and an experimental group, if we use the same maths test in every single study, we don't need an effect size. We can just use the scores on the test. If you're using different tests for different research studies, you need to check whether those tests are testing the same thing, which you can't do because you haven't got access to the tests. And that's why effect sizes are so popular, but they're wrong, because they're assuming that those things are assessing the same thing, and they're not. So that's why any statistician will tell you effect sizes are only justifiable when they're unnecessary, because you've got the original memory. That's why they don't use effect sizes in medicine. They use 5-year survival rates for cancer. They use time to discharge for arthroscopic surgery, because effect sizes don't tell you anything. You need to know how much extra achievement will we get. So I'm going to skip you a few slides here. There's basically a whole lot of expansion on that in the slide deck. But I just want to mention the file draw problem. A wonderful cartoon from Randall Munro, who writes under the name of XKCD. Jelly beans cause acne. Scientists investigate. We found no link between jelly beans. But I hear it's only a certain color that causes it. Okay. No link between purple jelly beans, or brown, or pink, or blue, or teal, or every single one has got a P greater than 0.05. No link between gray, tan, whoa, green jelly beans cause acne. Significant at the 5% level. So, first of all, you've got this problem with multiple comparisons. You've got clustering. What's the N in the study? They usually use the number of students, but if the students are in the same class, their experiences are more similar than kids in different classes. So the N is really the number of teachers, and if the teachers are talking to each other, the N is actually the number of schools. So you actually typically find if the intervention is involving the teacher rather than just giving rewards to students, for example, for reading, if it's at the teacher level, you probably need 100 schools for a randomized control trial. It's huge. You get this thing called harking, hypothesizing after the results are known. And so there's a classic example of this from Carol Dweck. They did a study of growth mindset. The effect was significant at the 0.07 level. Not significant. And they said, well, it was approaching significance. Now, that is a no-no in statistical speak. Approaching significance is like approaching pregnancy. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. You either are or you are not pregnant, and you either are or you're not significant. But they said, well, the experiment was too small. It would have been significant if the experiment had been bigger. But you don't know that the extra results would have come in the same way. So you get that all the time. Or outcome switching. So we do an experiment to improve maths achievement. Oh, well, no effect. Oh, but improved attitudes. Well, that was our aim all along. Why is that a no-no? Because then, if you're using a 5% significance level, you've done 2 tests. You gave yourselves 2 bites at the cherry, so now you should be using a 2.5% level for each test rather than 5% because you gave yourselves 2 chances to be successful. And most people don't do that. They just keep on testing at the 5% level until they find this idea of Ronald Coase torturing the data until it confesses. Implementation. So this is what's really interesting, is that we talk about fidelity of implementation. You've heard about this idea of fidelity of implementation? This is basically researchers blaming teachers for not doing what the researchers wanted. They say fidelity of implementation was weak. You've seen recently Sal Khan of the Khan Academy claiming that when kids were using AI, their results went up. Yeah, but they included only 5% of the kids who did it. They said it worked when it was implemented with fidelity, and it's only 5%. Now, why is that a no-no? Well, here's the problem. It could be that your intervention is so complicated that only the most outstanding teachers can implement it with fidelity. So what you're getting is not a program effect, it's a teacher selecting effect. You are basically just singling out the most amazing teachers because they're the only ones who can make it work. So that's why good researchers always use what's called an intention to treat analysis rather than a treatment on the treated analysis. So if you take an experiment, randomize 2 groups, look at the control group, look at the treatment group, and then only include the treatment group where they actually did the experiment properly, that is a treatment on the treated analysis. But what you should be doing, if you're looking at system effects, is the intention to treat. So in the study that I was involved with on formative assessment, people asked us, what about fidelity of implementation? Don't care, didn't measure it, not interested. Because it's just an excuse. It didn't work. And we're going to blame the teachers for not doing it. Well, what was the training like? So just let me finish, just get to the, I want to leave a bit of time to get some questions. So basically, this is a famous, I don't know if you know this phrase, not even wrong, but this is a famous remark by Wolfgang Pauli about a young physicist's work, and he was saying basically it's so bad, it's not even wrong. But this researcher, Scheel, used it to describe, basically, even when the result is significant, because we don't know what the people did in the experiment, we don't even know what they did. So here's the big takeaway. We should look for adequate theorization. Did the researchers include all the variables that you know matter in your context? Was the intervention standardized? Was it the same thing? And did they use intention to treat analyses? Did they actually include everybody who was subject to the intervention, not how well they did it? And so basically, there's always going to be trade-offs. There's no perfect solutions, only trade-offs. Research can guide these efforts with these 5 questions. But that's why I think you need to be critical consumers of educational research. Nobody can do this thinking for you. Nobody can actually work out whether this is going to work in your context. And that's why I think it's really important that you're engaged. And I'd love to give you the answers. When we first started with teachers on formative assessment, and we shared the research that Paul Black and I had reviewed for this Inside the Black Box booklet, they thought we were operating a perverted model of discovery learning where we knew what we wanted them to do, but they had to discover it for themselves. And after about 3 months, the teachers realized we did not know what this looked like in the classroom. We were keen because we thought the research was interesting and maybe potentially important, but we were keen to work, well, does this work in classrooms? And in particular, does it work in classrooms where teachers are driven by the need to improve test scores? We now know that it is compatible. But we had to do that by working with teachers to see whether it works in real classrooms. So that's why it's so hard to improve accountability scores. Partly because the system is insensitive to the things that teachers are changing, but mostly because we're not doing the kinds of things we need to be doing to invest in teachers. We're still focusing on trying to work out who the good teachers are and who the less good teachers are, which creates competition. So, if Leanne and I are both in line for a bonus, I'm not going to share my good ideas with her, because she might get the bonus then. It reminds me of the joke of the two men coming across a bear in the woods in California. And what should we do? It's a mother bear with a cub. The bear starts snarling, and one guy says, we could turn and run. The other guy says, that's stupid. No one can outrun a bear. The other guy says, true, but I can outrun you. So basically, I think the only way forward is for those within a leadership position to look at the research and then make a judgment about what's going to work best for your students, your context, your place, and then create that environment where every teacher works together in moving forward. And we hold teachers accountable for two things. One is getting better, and the other is supporting their colleagues in getting better. That's intelligent accountability. Holding teachers to account for things they don't control is what I would call unintelligent accountability. And I'm afraid we've still got too much of the unintelligent variety. Ultimately, you have the answers in your own schools. As I said earlier, I think teacher quality is randomly distributed around the system. Every school, even at the bottom of those so-called league tables, has amazing teachers. So the important thing is learning from each other. And as I said in the panel discussion, just getting into the habit of evaluating, doing things in a way that's potentially something you can learn from, rather than saying, yeah, well, it worked, but we have no idea why. So I'll stop there. Very happy. I think the new timing is we got finishing at 10 past. Yeah, got 5 minutes. So we have a microphone here. Anybody want to ask any questions? Or, objections, counterclaims, critical comments?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Fascinating, and a lot of challenge there, I think, for a whole bunch of thinking. But you mentioned Michaela earlier on.
Yes.
And we've had Catherine Birbal-Singh here in Australia on a number of occasions. And her point of view is relatively simple. She said, she's obviously a great teacher. She's charismatic. And she would, I'm not sure what she'd say about the theory, but she says, you know what a great teacher is, and you just get out there and you do it. Now, you know Catherine, I presume, you know what Michaela...
No, I know Michaela. I've never met her personally.
So how, when you look at, particularly looking at background, I think one of your key comments was background is 90% of everything when it comes to schools, and schools, the additive is relatively small. Given Michaela, given the background of the kids are all very challenged, and the outcome, I believe, is one of the 8th best schools in the UK or something like that, that school's making a difference.
Yes, it is.
She's making a difference.
Yes.
What lessons can we take from that, given it's one example where your thesis, not that it is a thesis, but in terms of the relevance of schools, really seems challenged?
Well, so first of all, I would say that school processes make a difference. Family background makes a difference. Genetics makes a difference. All these things make a difference. But what Michaela's doing very well is producing research that is amazingly consistent with the psychological research about taking small steps, experiencing high success rates. And there's a range of pedagogical practices that are consistent across the school. So they've basically taken the research and said to every teacher, if you're going to be a teacher at the school, you're going to do this. And the lessons are very, very impressive, and the kids are... And it definitely works. The question for me is it over-engineered? It does, I think. So there's no, kids aren't allowed to talk in corridors. Well, I don't know. Some people have a problem with that. So my research question is it scalable? Is it scalable? So, absent the ability to clone Catherine Birbal-Singh, what can we do? Can we do this? And I would say we need to do some more learning from that. But I certainly think that there's other schools that are doing pretty well. The other thing is, I don't know how random the selection of kids is. It's very... No, it's not. It's not.
Parents have to put their hand up.
Yes.
That's the bias.
Yes.
But there's no fees.
Oh, no. But the point is that the question is... Right, and they have to put that... It's like the Success Academies in New York. They're basically selecting parents and not kids. And they have to agree to all these things. And, these kids are up for it. So I don't know how scalable it is, but I think what's great about Michaela is it's a proof of concept. It is a proof that We're leaving student achievement on the table. We're basically not getting out of our students what we could do with a very highly structured approach. And the other thing is, apart from the things like not talking in corridors, it's so much like what schooling was like in the traditional schools in the 1950s and 60s. It was okay. We lost a lot. We now have research that shows why it works. It was just the experience of teachers that taught in that way. Here's the really ironic thing. When I went to school in the 1960s, we had 35-minute lessons. And the kids stayed stationary, apart from science, and the teachers moved. We then, 35 minutes is too short. We need double lessons, and then hour lessons, an hour. So you got French twice a week, rather than every day. And now what we know about distributed practice, maybe those 35-minute lessons were a good idea. Maybe having shorter lessons, which are much more punchy, was actually more effective. So, some of that research is vindicating, the mixed problems that people hated at the end of a chapter in a maths textbook. I like to do one kind of problem and get into the groove and do the same problem over and over again. But of course, that's less effective than mixed practice rather than block practice. So interleave practice, as it's called. Yeah. So yeah, we could learn a lot, and the results are really off the charts. I mean, they are kids making something like 40% more progress than average in that school over 5 years. It's really quite impressive. Let's see why they are at A-level, because one of the problems with the KIPP academies in America was those kids were very successful at school, but they were hothoused for the tests they were taking, and they weren't doing, they don't seem to be very good autonomous learners. My hunch is the Michaela kids will do very well at university as well, but we'll see.
Well, in that case, I would like to extend a very warm thank you to Dylan for this afternoon's session. I don't know about you, but in the middle there, I was feeling a bit of helplessness, and that it's all coming down to the teacher, but we don't know what makes a great teacher. I think that love the one you're with is absolutely beautiful. If you're wanting to know more about that, Dylan's about to run a session on mastery. What's the name of your session? Mastery in teaching?
Getting out of the way.
Getting out of the way. So please come along to his next session if you would like to learn more about that, but thank you.
And I don't know how I'm going to do it yet, but again, the slides for this session will be available to you.
Excellent.
I've already sent them through to the conference organisers, so I don't know how they want to distribute them, but if they haven't been posted, we'll figure out something.
Yeah, thanks.
Professor, how are you?
All right, good.
I'm Mark. I'm actually not from an education background.
Okay.
I'm from Mercy Hills Foundation. I